It is almost dawn on the Thermopylae path, and the pine forest smells of resin and old stone. Somewhere below, where sulfur steam curls from the earth and gives this pass its name, the hot gates, 7,000 Greek soldiers are sleeping in their armor, bronze still warm from a second day of killing. They do not know that a man is climbing the mountain above them. His name is Ephialtes. He is local, he knows the goat trails, and he is walking toward the Persian camp to sell the one thing that will undo everything these men have bled for: a way around the pass. In the real version of this story, he makes it. The Persians pour through the mountains. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans die on a hillock. Under a rain of arrows, Athens burns. And Western civilization survives only because of a naval battle fought weeks later, in a strait most people cannot find on a map. But what if Ephialtes does not make it? What if a Phocian sentry on the ridge hears a branch snap in the dark, and a spear finds a traitor's ribs before the traitor finds a Persian king? Yes, this is high on the improbable list, and yet, consider the numbers. 7,000 men held a pass against perhaps 100,000 for 2 full days, and did not give a single yard. Not one. That is not legend. That is Herodotus. That is 1 hoplite for every 14 Persians, and the 14 lost. If you are new here, hit subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment telling us where you are listening from tonight. Because if Leonidas holds that pass, if the hot gates stay shut, then Athens never burns. The most famous last stand in history becomes the most famous victory. And the balance of power across the ancient world tilts on the weight of one body that never delivered its message. Why does a local man from a town most Greeks could not name hold the future of Western philosophy in his hands? And what happens to a civilization whose founding myth is not a beautiful defeat, but a win? To understand how much changes, it is necessary to stand in the past before the hinge breaks. The summer of 480 BC, Xerxes I of Persia, son of Darius, grandson through his mother Atossa of Cyrus the Great himself, has marched what may be the largest army the ancient world has ever assembled down the eastern coast of Greece. Herodotus, writing a generation later, puts the number at 2.6 million. Modern historians, armed with supply calculations and road capacity math, scale it back to somewhere between 120,000 and 200,000 fighting men, plus an equivalent mass of camp followers, engineers, and slaves. Even at the lower estimate, it is a force that drinks rivers dry and strips the countryside bare just by passing through. A fleet of perhaps 600 warships shadows the army along the coast. The scale is not just military, it is geological. An army that size changes the landscape it crosses. Herodotus records a strange scene before the invasion even reached Greece. Xerxes, surveying his host from a hillside near the Hellespont, suddenly wept. When asked why, he said that in 100 years, not one of these men would be alive. A king of kings, about 37 years old, weeping for mortality, and then marching his army south to die in someone else's pass. Against this, the Greeks have managed something that is almost as remarkable as the battle itself: a coalition. The Hellenic League, forged in a series of fractious congresses at Corinth, has assembled a force of roughly 7,000 hoplites and sent them north to hold the narrowest point on the road to central Greece. The pass at Thermopylae is, in places, barely wide enough for a single cart. On one side, the cliffs. On the other, the sea. At the center, a crumbling wall built by the Phocians in some earlier war, now patched and manned. It is the best defensive position in Greece, and everyone knows it. The man holding it is Leonidas I of Sparta, Agiad king, and he is old for this work, early to mid-50s, which in a world of bronze spearheads and no antibiotics makes him the oldest man in the pass by a comfortable margin. He has brought 300 Spartiates, his royal guard, hand-picked, every one of them a father, because Spartan law said a man with a son had fulfilled his obligation to the bloodline, and could afford to spend himself. The rest of the force is a patchwork. Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, Arcadians, Phocians, 1,000 men here, 700 there. They have come because Leonidas came, and Leonidas came because someone had to. Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king sitting at Xerxes' side, as an advisor, a man who had lost his throne and fled to Persia, tried to warn his host. "Free they are," he said, "but not entirely free. Their master is the law, and they fear it more than your people fear you. Whatever it commands, they do, and it commands them never to retreat from battle, however great the odds, but to stand firm and conquer or die." Xerxes, Herodotus writes, laughed. He would not laugh long. On the morning before the first assault, a Persian scout rode close enough to the Greek position to see the Spartans exercising outside the wall. Some were running sprints. Others were combing their long hair, working bone combs through tangles with the same unhurried focus they might give to preparing a meal. The scout reported this to Xerxes, who found it baffling. Demaratus did not. He told the king that when Spartans comb their hair, they are preparing to fight, and when Spartans prepare to fight, they expect to kill or to die, and they do not particularly care which. Then the killing begins. The pass at Thermopylae on the first morning of battle is a corridor of noise and dust and bronze. The Persians come in waves, the Medes first, driven forward by officers with whips, because the only thing more frightening than a wall of Greek shields is the punishment for refusing to charge it. The defile is so narrow that numbers mean nothing. It does not matter if 100,000 men stand behind the front rank. Only the first 8 can fight. And the first 8 are facing hoplites in overlapping bronze, each man's shield protecting the man to his left, the wall bristling with iron-tipped spear points at throat and groin height. The Medes hit the Greek line, and the sound carries off the cliff walls, a metallic crash of shield on shield. And the dust rises so thick a man tastes grit between his teeth, and the Medes break. They pull back, leaving their dead in the narrows. More come. They break again. On the second day, Xerxes sends the Immortals, his 10,000 elite, the best infantry in the Persian Empire, gilded and proud and terribly wrong for this ground. They are skirmishers by training, light infantry meant for open fields and flanking maneuvers. And Leonidas has given them a hallway. The Spartans rotate their units in shifts, fresh men stepping forward while exhausted men rest behind the wall, a discipline no other army in the ancient world could match. The Immortals fare no better than the Medes. By the evening of the second day, the Persian dead lie thick enough in the narrows to obstruct the living, and Xerxes, according to Herodotus, leaps from his throne 3 times in frustration. Later writers say Leonidas answered Xerxes' demand to surrender arms in 2 words the Persians never forgot. Molon lab, come and take them. Whether those words are his, or belong to the centuries of men who wish they could have said them, the meaning is the same. The pass is not for sale, and Herodotus preserves a line from a Spartan named Dionysius, told that the Persian archers would loose so many arrows they would blot out the sun. "Good," Dionysius reportedly answered. "Then we shall fight in the shade." It is the kind of line that makes you wonder whether Spartans were fearless or just incapable of taking anything seriously. Night falls on the second day. Xerxes sits in his tent, and somewhere on the mountain above the pass, a man is making a decision. The pine forest on the Anapaea path is black under a half-moon, and the air smells of resin and cold stone. Ephialtes of Trachis is climbing. He is not a soldier. He is a local man, a farmer, a herder, possibly a fisherman, and what he knows is the mountain. He knows the goat trails that thread through the trees above the hop gates, the places where the rock flattens and a man can walk without tripping, the shrine of Pan, where shepherds leave offerings of cheese and honey. He knows the path that will take a column of Persian soldiers from the north side of the pass to the south side in a single night. And he is going to sell it. His motive is old and ordinary. Herodotus says it plainly. For the sake of a reward. Maybe there is more. Maybe he fears what happens to his village, if the Persians lose and blame the locals. Maybe he holds a grudge against the Phocians who guard the ridge. It does not matter, because he does not reach the Persian camp. Somewhere between the shrine of Pan and the ridgeline, where the path narrows and the pines lean close enough to touch both sides at once, a Phocian sentry hears a sound, a branch bending under a foot, a scatter of pebbles. The sentry does what sentries do on dark mountains when an empire is camped below. He does not call out. He throws his javelin. The sound is brief. The thud of an iron point finding a body, a gasp, the rustle of a man falling into pine needles. By morning the Phocians will find a dead local on the path with no weapon and no armor and no explanation. They will not know what he was carrying. They will never know. And because they do not know, everything that follows is different. Dawn of the third day, and the same self-esteem that curled through the pass on the first morning rises again from the hot springs. Leonidas wakes to an intact position. No shouts from the ridge. No Phocian runners stumbling down the mountain with news of a Persian column on the path above. The sentries report a quiet night. One dead local on the ridge. Cause unclear, probably a thief or a deserter. No one in the Greek camp understands what almost happened. What almost happened was the end of everything they are fighting for. The Greeks eat barley porridge and check their spear shafts and take their positions behind the wall. And for the third time in 3 days, the Persians come. But this time the assault is different, because the army making it is different. 2 days of slaughter in the Narrows have bled the best units Xerxes has. The Amorphals are shaken. The Medes are hollowed out. The levies from the empire's eastern provinces, Bactrians and Indians and Saki, are brave enough, but trained for open country, and utterly wrong for this ground. Spear shafts snap like kindling in the collision. The grunt of men in close formation, the sound of a shoulder driving into a shield. The sickening give when a line buckles and then hardens again. Blood darkens the dust underfoot. The third assault fails like the first two, worse, because the men making it know it will fail before they start. By midday, the Persian officers cannot drive their infantry forward at any price. That evening, in the royal tent, a council of war convenes around a king who has spent 3 days watching his army feed itself into a stone corridor and come back in pieces. The generals speak carefully, because Xerxes is not a man who tolerates the word failure, but the logistics speak for themselves. An army of 100,000 men or more needs 100 to 200 tons of food and fodder per day. That is the weight of 200 war chariots consumed before breakfast. The local countryside is stripped bare. The supply lines stretch back to Thessaly, and the fleet at Artemisium is locked in a stalemate with the Greek navy, unable to land provisions along the coast. Every day the pass holds. Xerxes' army eats itself. Autumn approaches. For the first time the unthinkable is spoken aloud in the Persian camp. Pull back. Not retreat. Regroup for the winter. Return in spring. But even as the words are said, everyone in the tent knows what pulling back means. It means the pass held. It means Greece won. The withdrawal begins before dawn, the vast Persian camp folding in on itself like a city packing to move, which is essentially what it is. Columns of infantry turn north. Baggage trains creak into motion. The fleet begins to disengage from Artemisium, and when the sun rises, the Greeks emerge from the pass to find the plain beyond it, emptying, dust clouds on the northern road, the remnants of cook fires still smouldering. Leonidas is alive. The 300 are alive, and 700 men from the small Boeotian city of Thespiae, men who in another version of this story refused to withdraw and died beside the Spartans, and were largely forgotten by history, are alive. They sit in the morning light and eat bread and olives, and drink watered wine, and the emotional weight of survival settles on them like something physical. Plutarch preserves a line Leonidas supposedly delivered on what he expected to be his last morning. Breakfast, men, for we dine in Hades. In this timeline he says it, and then does not dine in Hades. He watches them eat supper instead. Men laugh, and the sound is strange to them, because none of them expected to make it again. Athens still stands. What does that mean? News of Thermopylae reaches the Greek world in waves. Runners carry it south. Then merchant ships carry it across the water. And within days the story is everywhere, but it is not the story the real timeline tells. In the real timeline, Thermopylae is a glorious defeat, a sacrifice, a last stand. The name becomes a byword for dying beautifully. In this timeline, Thermopylae is an unbreakable victory. The pass held, Leonidas held. The Persians came with the largest army ever assembled, and they turned around and left. Could one battle really shift the allegiance of half a dozen city-states overnight? It already did once. Marathon 10 years earlier, a single morning on a flat Attic field. And Athens went from a modest city-state to the most self-confident community in Greece. A victory at Thermopylae is Marathon multiplied. It is not one city's triumph. It is all of Greece, shoulder to shoulder, holding the line. The propaganda writes itself. Wavering cities that were calculating the odds of Persian victory and preparing to submit. The Greek word for it was Medais, now rally to the League. Thebes, which in the real timeline was caught agonizingly between sides, throws in with the victors. The Corinthian Congress is electrified. Delegations arrive from cities that had sent excuses instead of soldiers, suddenly eager to claim a share of the glory. And here is where it gets interesting, because if Sparta is the hero and Athens is not, the war that defines the next century of Greek history may never happen. Stop and think about what is missing from this world. There is no Salamis. There is no story of Themistocles tricking Xerxes into fighting in a narrow strait. There is no legend of Athens rising from its own ashes. The greatest naval battle of the ancient world simply does not happen. Walk through what that means. Athens does not burn. The Acropolis stands. The temples of Athena Polias, the archaic limestone shrines built by an earlier generation, are unharmed. The refugees who historically crowded onto ships and watched their cities smoke from the decks at Salamis stay home. Themistocles, the low-born political genius who convinced Athens to spend its silver windfall on 200 warships, still has his fleet. But he does not have his hour. The moral and emotional capital that Athens historically drew from the story of sacrificing its city and saving Greece at sea evaporates like the steam from the hot gates. Within 15 years of Salamis, in the real timeline, Athens controlled a maritime empire of over 150 allied or subject states and collected roughly 460 talents of tribute per year. 460 talents is approximately 12 metric tons of silver, enough to build the Parthenon every 3 years. The Delian League, originally an anti-Persian alliance, became an Athenian protection racket, and it was Salamis that justified it. We burned our city for you. You owe us. In this timeline, Athens has its temples already. It does not need to rebuild, and it does not have the story that justifies an empire. None of it exists. Xerxes returns to Susa. The invasion has failed, not catastrophically in the way that empires usually fail. No annihilation, no captured king, but decisively enough. He has lost tens of thousands of men, enormous quantities of supplies, and most critically, the aura of inevitability. The Achaemenid Empire ruled from Egypt to the Indus by projecting the simple belief that resistance was futile. That belief has cracked. But surely Persia just comes back. It has the manpower, the gold, the bureaucratic infrastructure. It came back after Marathon, did it not? Yes, but consider what happened to Rome after Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD. 3 Roman legions marched into a German forest and were destroyed in an ambush that lasted 3 days. Augustus, the most powerful man on earth, reportedly wandered his palace at night, banging his head against the walls and crying out for his lost commander to give him back his legions. Rome was far more centralized, far more militarily efficient than Persia, and it never went back across the Rhine. Not once in 400 years. Not because it could not, because the cost-benefit calculus changed permanently. One defeat made the frontier real. Thermopylae becomes the Persian Rhine. Demaratus had warned him. Now the warning is prophecy. And there is a closer parallel still. In 1260, the Mamluk Sultanate met a Mongol army at Ain Jalut in Palestine. One battle, the Mongols had burned from China to Hungary, the largest land empire in human history. After Ain Jalut, they never conquered Egypt. One valley, one afternoon, one wall they could not break, and the Mongol Empire accepted a boundary. Greece is now that wall. But walls need to be governed, and the Greeks have never been especially good at governing each other. In the real timeline, Salamis gave Athens the moral authority and the naval muscle to build the Delian League, extract tribute, and become an imperial democracy. Without Salamis, Athens still has its fleet. Themistocles built it before Thermopylae, and the silver mines at Laurium still produce wealth. Athens still develops democracy, still attracts philosophers and playwrights, still possesses a harbour that makes it the natural commercial hub of the Aegean. But it is not the hegemon. It is a prosperous, cultured naval city-state that must share influence with a Sparta riding the greatest military victory in Greek memory. Here is the strange part. The Athens that never burned may, in some ways, be a richer city. Its archaic temples intact, its population never traumatized by evacuation, its treasury never drained by reconstruction. But it is not the Athens the world remembers. The Parthenon, as it exists in our memory, was a war memorial built with Delian League tribute to replace what Xerxes destroyed. No destruction, no tribute empire, no Parthenon. The most famous building in the Western world may never exist. Or it may exist as something completely different, an expansion of the old temple built with Athenian silver, not allied gold. And if Athens does not build its maritime empire, and Sparta does not need to fear Athenian expansion, then the question becomes, does the Peloponnesian War, the conflict that tore Greece apart for 27 years, ever happen at all? Sparta is now the undisputed champion of Greece. The Thermopylae myth is their Gettysburg, their Stalingrad, their finest hour, and unlike most finest hours, it is earned. Leonidas walked into a pass, outnumbered 14-1, and walked out alive. Spartan prestige is at its absolute zenith. The Hellenic League, born of the Persian threat, now has no external enemy pressing hard enough to hold it together, and yet the memory of Thermopylae is fresh enough to keep the alliance breathing. Could Sparta really hold a pan-Hellenic alliance together? On its own terms, probably not for long. Spartan governance was brilliant at producing soldiers, and terrible at producing diplomats. The entire Spartan system depended on enslaved helots farming the land so that Spartiates could train for war full-time, and that system did not scale. But here is the precedent. Prussia was also a rigid, military-dominated state with a narrow ruling class and a reputation for discipline over creativity. And yet Bismarck, working within that system, unified Germany in a decade, forging a patchwork of jealous principalities into a single empire through shared wars and a unifying myth. The question is not whether Sparta has the culture for empire. It does not. The question is whether the Thermopylae myth gives it enough gravitational pull to hold the League together long enough for a more flexible Greek political culture to evolve around it. And the answer, looking at how fast the German principalities consolidated under a shared victory narrative, is plausibly yes. There is a deep irony here. In the real timeline, Sparta won the Peloponnesian War and then collapsed within a generation, because it had no idea how to run the hegemony it had won. In this timeline, Sparta never fights the Peloponnesian War, and may stumble into a longer, slower version of leadership precisely because it is never tested to destruction. The greatest military victory in Greek history may be the thing that finally forces Sparta to learn politics. The men who combed their hair before killing now sit in council chambers, and the adjustment is painful. In the real timeline, Athens' imperial overreach culminated in the catastrophe at Syracuse in 413 BC. The Sicilian expedition, a disaster so total it broke Athenian power and morale beyond recovery. That expedition was born of Athenian confidence, Athenian wealth, Athenian restlessness. In a world where Athens never becomes the tribute-fed empire, that restlessness has no fuel. Syracuse never sees an Athenian fleet. The Western Mediterranean develops differently. Over the decades following Thermopylae, the League evolves. It is not a nation-state. Greek particularism, the fierce local pride of each city-state, is too strong for that. But it is more cohesive than anything the Greeks managed in the real timeline. Annual congresses at Corinth, shared military obligations, a common fund for defense and road building. Sparta provides the military spine. Athens provides the fleet and the cultural magnetism. Corinth provides the commercial network. its merchants threading the sea lanes between Italy and Asia Minor. The Persian Empire, stung by Thermopylae and increasingly distracted by revolts in Egypt and Babylon, which historically happened anyway under the satrap, Inaros and others, largely withdraws from the Western Aegean. A lasting Greek federation, is that not pure fantasy? Look at the Achaean League of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. It managed to unite much of the Peloponnese under a federal system, with shared citizenship, common coinage, and coordinated foreign policy. It lasted over a century, and it had no Thermopylae victory to cement it, no shared founding myth of salvation. Give the Greeks that myth, and give them it a century earlier, and the ceiling for cooperation rises dramatically. It is not a utopia. Greek city-states still quarrel, still fight border wars, still produce demagogues and tyrants, and the usual run of human failure. But the center holds, because the center has a story. The Persian Empire is not dead. It is still the largest state on earth, spanning from the cataracts of the Nile to the river valleys of the Indus. But its western frontier has stabilized at the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, and even there, the Greek cities of Ionia are restless. In the real timeline, the Peace of Callias, negotiated around 449 BC, formalized a rough boundary between Greek and Persian spheres of influence. In this timeline, the boundary is drawn earlier, more firmly and more favorably for Greece. Some Ionian cities, Miletus, Ephesus, Halicarnassus, push for autonomy or outright alliance with the Hellenic League. Persia, dealing with the internal fractures that plagued it throughout the 5th century, cannot afford another Greek adventure. The empire is vast, but vastness is its own kind of vulnerability. Every rebellion in Egypt, every ambitious satrap in Lydia, every succession crisis in Susa is a crack that widens when the prestige at the center thins. Does the Peloponnesian War happen? Not as we know it. Without the Athenian tribute empire, without the Megarian decree, without the spiral of fear between a naval superpower and a land superpower, the specific triggers do not exist. There are still Greek wars. There are always Greek wars. But they are border disputes, colonial rivalries, the usual fratricidal politics of city-states that have quarreled since the Bronze Age. They do not produce a 27-year catastrophe that kills a generation and leaves Greece prostrate for Macedon to pick up. In the real timeline, by 338 BC, Greece was so exhausted from internal wars that Philip II of Macedon conquered it at Chaeronea, with an army smaller than what Leonidas had faced at the Hot Gates. In this timeline, Greece is not exhausted. Philip still exists. Macedon still exists. But Philip is looking south at a Greek world that has not spent a century bleeding itself dry, a world with intact armies, full treasuries, and the institutional memory of collective defense. Macedon may find that wall much harder to break. This is the great open question, the one that changes the shape of everything that comes after. In the real timeline, Alexander III of Macedon, 20 years old when he inherited his father's throne, conquered the entire Persian Empire in a decade, because Greece was already under Macedonian control, giving him a unified base, a battle-hardened army, and access to the finest military talent in the Mediterranean. In this alternate timeline, Greece is not Macedonian. It is a fractious but functioning league that views Macedon the way it has always viewed Macedon, as a semi-barbarian kingdom to the north, useful for timber and cavalry, but not fit for the high table of Hellenic civilization. Here is the most dramatic possibility. Alexander, or someone very like Alexander, still exists. Macedon still breeds ambitious kings with brilliant military minds and an appetite for conquest. But instead of conquering a broken Greece, and then marching east, this Alexander must negotiate with a powerful Hellenic league. Perhaps he joins it. Perhaps a combined Greco-Macedonian force, with Greek hoplites and Macedonian cavalry, still marches east, but as allies, not conqueror and subject. The precedent is clear. Alexander's own army in the real timeline was already heavy with Greek mercenaries, Thessalian cavalry, and engineers recruited from across the Greek world. The talent pool does not change. What changes is the political relationship. and that changes everything about what happens after the conquest. In the real timeline, Alexander dismantled the entire Achaemenid Empire in 10 years. That proves the empire was vulnerable. Its sheer size masked internal fragility, the kind of brittleness that shatters under the right blow. A Greek world that is more united and less war-torn by the mid-4th century might produce an Eastern campaign even sooner, or it might produce something stranger. A Greek commercial and cultural expansion along the coasts of Asia Minor and the Levant that erodes Persian control without the need for a single great conqueror. Persia did not fall to Alexander because of Alexander alone. It fell because it was already hollowing out. Satraps were in open revolt. Egypt had been lost and reconquered twice. The royal court was riven by assassination and intrigue. In this timeline, the hollowing may produce a different kind of collapse, slower, more distributed, led by Greek traders and colonists, rather than a single king with a god complex. The king who wept for mortality fed his army to a pass, and his empire began its long exhale. Does Alexander march east? Maybe. Maybe not. But someone does, or something does. Greek culture pushes east, whether by the spear or the merchant ship, because a confident, unbroken Greek world has every reason to expand, and a weakening Persia has every reason to crack. Now the lens pulls back to its widest setting, and the centuries unfold. In the real timeline, the sequence was this: Persian wars, then Athenian Empire, then the Peloponnesian War, then Greek exhaustion, then Macedonian conquest, then the Hellenistic fragmentation into warring successor kingdoms, then Roman absorption. Each step was contingent on the one before it. Remove the Athenian Empire from the sequence, and the dominoes fall differently. A more balanced, federated Greece, still fractious, still competitive, but never catastrophically self-destructive, enters the 3rd century BC as the dominant cultural and military force of the Eastern Mediterranean. Could Greek civilization really have remained the dominant force, without being absorbed by a larger empire? Consider the Greek colonies of southern Italy and Sicily, the region the Romans called Magna Graecia. Syracuse alone was one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean, rivaling Athens at its height. These colonies maintained Greek culture, language and political forms for centuries, without being unified under a single state. A Greek world that avoids the Peloponnesian catastrophe might produce a Western Mediterranean full of thriving, independent, culturally Greek cities that Rome must contend with. And Rome's own trajectory changes if it faces not a divided, war-weary Magna Graecia, but a confident one backed by a functioning mainland league. The collision between a rising Rome and a living Greek world, rather than a conquered Hellenistic one, produces a Mediterranean that neither civilization would recognize. And here is where it becomes truly strange. In the real timeline, Greek philosophy, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, eventually merged with Christianity to produce the intellectual framework of the Western world. That merger happened partly because Greek culture was carried by Alexander's conquests into the Near East, where it mixed with Jewish thought in the cities of the Hellenistic kingdoms. In a timeline where Greek culture spreads differently, more slowly, more commercially, more under Spartan martial influence than Athenian democratic influence, the philosophical tradition might look very different. A Greece whose founding myth is Thermopylae rather than Salamis, whose dominant ethos is Spartan discipline rather than Athenian openness, might produce a harder, more austere intellectual tradition. The democracy that the modern world celebrates as the Greek gift to civilization might be a minority experiment, an Athenian curiosity rather than the defining legacy. The schools of philosophy might prize endurance over inquiry, duty over freedom, the collective over the individual, not because Athens ceases to think, but because the culture that surrounds it prizes the soldier-citizen over the philosopher-citizen, and the thinkers who flourish are the ones whose ideas fit that frame. Think about what exists in this world. Not the Parthenon, or not the Parthenon as anyone knows it. Not Athenian tragedy written in the shadow of imperial guilt. Not Thucydides writing the history of a war that may never have happened. The war between Athens and Sparta that produced the most brutal and honest political analysis the ancient world ever offered. The books are different. The buildings are different. The arguments about what a citizen owes the state and what the state owes a citizen are different. And somewhere downstream, in ways no one can fully predict, the religions might be different too, because the soil in which they grow has been turned by a different plough. In the real timeline, the Peloponnesian War killed an estimated 1/3 of the population of Attica and devastated Spartan manpower so badly that by 371 BC there were fewer than 1,000 full Spartiates left, from a peak of perhaps 8,000. 7 out of every 8 Spartan warriors gone. Remove that war, and Greece enters the 4th century with tens of thousands more trained soldiers, intact economies, and a generation of young men who were never born into ruin. The Acropolis that Pericles never had to rebuild stands in its archaic beauty, and the skyline tells a different story. The Thespians went home. That is the sentence that changes everything. Return to the Anapaea path at night. One man on a mountain, a branch snapping in the dark. A Phocian sentry who did or did not hear it. That is the hinge, and from it, a cascade that rewrites the map of the ancient world. Leonidas lives. Athens never burns. Sparta becomes the champion of a league that holds. The war that never opened never bleeds Greece dry. Alexander's march east may happen with allies instead of subjects, or may not happen at all. Replaced by something slower and stranger, a Greek expansion carried by merchant ships and colonists, rather than a cavalry charge across the Granicus. The Persian Empire still stands, but its western frontier is a wall it chose not to cross again. And the civilization that emerged, the philosophy, the politics, the art, the arguments about how people should live, grows from different roots. Not Athenian tragedy born of imperial hubris, not Spartan legend born of heroic defeat. Something else, something no one alive today can fully see, because the hinge was so small and the cascade was so vast. In the real timeline, the epitaph carved at Thermopylae reads, "Go, stranger, and tell the Spartans that here we lie, obedient to their laws." In this timeline, there is no epitaph, because no one lies there. The monument is a victory marker, not a grave. And the difference between those two objects, a tombstone and a trophy, is the difference between two civilizations. The old king who outlived his legend went home to Sparta, and in this world died in his bed. He had told them they would dine in Hades. Instead, he watched them eat supper, and from there, who knows, a federated Greece that lasts into the 3rd century. A Persia that turns inward and fractures along different lines. A Rome that rises in the west, and meets not a conquered Hellenistic world scattered across successor kingdoms, but a living, functioning Greek civilization, proud and armed and old, and the collision between those two forces produces something neither of them expected. The Mediterranean becomes a different sea. The languages spoken on its shores shift in ways no linguist can reverse engineer from a single altered night. The gods worshipped in its temples answer to different names, or the same names in a different order, all of it hanging on a night in August, a mountain path, and a man who did not get where he was going, one body in the pine needles, one sentry who heard the branch, and a world unrecognizable from ours, all the way down.